IVM.
We are here to remind you to pay your credit card bills because paying on time is a good policy. Credit Power Play gives you a chance to win 100% cashback during the first 6 overs of both innings of any IPL match. Just pay your credit card bill and stand to win 100% cashback. Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and today I'm here with my colleague Suyash Desai, and we're going to be talking about developments taking place in Tibet. Now, obviously, there's a deep history of Tibet in India, and obviously there's a deep friction with regard to India and China with regard to Tibet. And over the years, we've sort of heard about Beijing tightening its control in Tibet. So we thought we'd look at some of the changes that have taken place in the last couple of years to build infrastructure in Tibet, which impinges on Indian security, or at least which we believe impinges on Indian security. And we'll try and talk about that. And I want to begin with Suyash asking you a little bit about the work that you've been doing in this direction. You had a recent piece in the Hindustan Times which talked about a new railway line that's being developed, which is the Sichuan-Tibet railway link. And you said that this will have an impact on India's national security. So let's just take us through the key arguments in your piece.
Hi Manoj, thanks for having me. So as we have been discussing, a lot of things are happening in Tibet Autonomous Region. So I'll before coming to the article, I'll just briefly elaborate on what is happening since the 14th 5-year plan has been rolled out. Unfortunately, we don't have an English copy of the plan yet. It's only available in Chinese. But Tibet has been highlighted as a major area where a lot of infrastructure work is going to happen in the next few years, in the next 5 years. One of the major infrastructure work is the line that you just mentioned, that Sichuan-Tibet high elevation railway, which will connect Chengdu, which is Sichuan province's capital, to Lhasa, which is capital of the Tibet Autonomous Region. This will be the second line going into Tibet. Previously, we already have one line that is going to Tibet from Qinghai. So this line is divided into 3 parts. One part is within Tibet, one part is within Sichuan. The third part is, which is also the middle part and the most dangerous part to work on, will connect Sichuan to Tibet. So why I say that it will have implications on India, because if you look at the rail route, it is passing very closely to Indian border. So in certain areas like Ningchi, the distance between the rail and the Indian border is almost 10 to 15 kilometers. So what it enables, if you look at mobilization, PLA's mobilization history, it mobilizes itself not only using army infrastructure but also civilian infrastructure. And when this railway line is formed, which is expected to be functional by 2030, the full railway line, PLA's mobility from Chengdu to this region will increase. When I say PLA's mobility from Chengdu will increase, why Chengdu is important? Chengdu is one of the major centers for Western Theatre Command. So we divide Western Theatre Command into 3-4 parts. So there are 2 major infrastructures and there are 2 military districts. One of the major infrastructure is housed in Chengdu, where a lot of infantry is placed. So and the role of this Theatre Command is to support Tibet Military District and Xinjiang Military District in case of a escalation, as we have seen, which happened recently during China-India standoff. So whenever there is an escalation going forward, and when this railway line becomes functional, Chengdu can very well mobilize a lot of artillery and support using this railway line, and that is why it is very important, and which will have implication on geopolitics and security from an Indian perspective. Second important point here is regarding border villages which are being set up by China. So border villages, if I'm not wrong, was briefly mentioned in the 19 Party Congress by Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping has had emphasized then that a border there should be buffer between Indian border and Tibetan villages, and border villages will be a buffer between that. Why were border villages important? The reason given for border villages were that it will be the first line of defense, it will act as a watch post, and it will curtail the movement of quote unquote pro Dalai Lama forces across the border. Now, this border villages, because it acts as a first line of defense and watch post, it will have implications on Indian security. And if you see border villages, I have divided border villages in two parts. One on the eastern side, one on the eastern Ladakh side, and one on the Tibet side, which is from India's middle sector up to the extreme end of Arunachal Pradesh. So there are three important counties here: Ningchi, Kona, Yangtong, and there are two other more important counties, Matong and Lunza. So these counties have already created villages along the Chinese border with India, and these villages, if you see the distance between some part of these villages and the upcoming railway line, it is very less. So this will also enable the railway line will also enable better control, consolidation, logistics supply to border villages. This will also have implications for Indian security going forward. So these two are important points to be highlighted while considering China-India relation going forward when this railway line becomes functional after 2030.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, at one level, you're building connectivity with the mainland to be able to better facilitate flow of goods and people, and of course, armored equipment also. And at the other level, you're also trying to create settled populations in these areas, which can act as your first line of defense. And you're also sort of creating new facts on the ground with these border villages, which can then start to, when you end up negotiating with India with regard to border settlements, at the end of the day, if there are human settlements out there which are established, it becomes very difficult to sort of negotiate that land away. So you end up creating some sort of a fait accompli where that in that negotiation you've got an upper hand. And from what I was reading, that in terms of border villages, they've already set up some 600 odd villages, which are going to sort of make a difference. And I think one of the first glimpse of this, at least in popular Indian media imagination, was I can't remember if this was earlier this year or late last year, when we spoke about this village. There were reports in the Indian media. I think NDTV was the first to report about it, about a village near the Arunachal Pradesh border. And there was lots of confusion about whether that village is within the Indian line or whether that's, on the Chinese side. But wherever it is, it was very, very close. And the idea was that, look, it's going to create this fact on the ground, which will then become difficult for India to negotiate away. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do. Also, one instance where the border village was suddenly a border village showed up in Bhutan. So they are creating it not only with India-China border on India-China border, but they're also creating it with China-Bhutan border. And all of a sudden, that village is created, and now one village doesn't make a difference, or the only villages will not make a difference because they are not very well militarized. But connecting it with railways and better road infrastructure, where mobilization can happen in a very different way, can have implications going forward in a lead to a change of status quo going forward. So these are very terrible implications that India needs to consider going forward.
Yeah, it's really difficult, right? Because how do you stop Beijing from building villages and building human settlements and creating connectivity on parts of territory which you may dispute but they control?
Correct.
And that's a really difficult challenge to do, because I can't see a way in which India can do that. The only sort of way to push back, at least in my mind, is to be able to ensure that you mirror some of that activity so that you also create facts on the ground, so that you can consolidate your position. And at least if then you want to negotiate away some of those facts on the ground, Beijing has to also negotiate away and give away what it's doing, if at least that can be done. Otherwise, there is absolutely no way in which India can prevent China from doing what it's doing, particularly with regard to the border villages, right?
Yes, correct, Manoj. Also, along with villages and railway line, we also have to focus on something else that is happening, and something else that was mentioned that was reportedly mentioned in the 14 5-year plan. That's the emphasis on building big dams on Brahmaputra, on upper riparian. They called it Yadlum Sangpo. It will also have a India will also have to be watchful and cautious regarding this development. India as well as Bangladesh has to be watchful and cautious on this development. That's because there are three important things to be considered here. One, it's an upper riparian. India and China already have one. It can lead to flooding in India. Second, China is not ready to share data, and sharing of data is very important. As you can see, India has also built dams on the upper riparians originating from Kashmir and going into Pakistan. But we have a signed treaty between the two countries where certain amount of data is being shared regularly. Such treaties are not in existence between China and India, and which can have negative consequences on security implications or negative security implications. And third important point here is militarization of water, which is not very well explored area, but people are talking about it. So these are the three important areas that India needs to consider. And they are from what has been reported, they are thinking of a dam that is of the size of three Georges Dam. And this is the major dam that they're thinking to build on the bend of Yarlung Sangpo, and multiple other projects along the way. So this would have the India would have also have to be cautious about what is happening and have to take it up with China going forward.
Yeah, I mean, on the water issue, we don't have a treaty with Beijing like the Indus Water Treaty. But what we do have is that in 2013 we had an MOU which was sort of recognizing that transboundary rivers are important to all countries, and therefore there's sort of you need to strengthen communication and conversation on that, and you need to sort of talk about data sharing and information sharing. And there was some information sharing agreements that were set up, and at the end of that, what we ended up getting, and sort of we saw how those agreements can be very easily pushed aside by Beijing, particularly when it comes to conflict, because I think in 2017, 2018, this is what happened, right? When we were I think we were during the Doklam standoff, when the water sharing, the data regarding the Brahmaputra, it stopped, right? It just stopped sharing the data. And that became problematic. So I think there are challenges in that context. And the greater dam building that happens in China, the more sort of concern we will see in India, Bangladesh, and lower riparian states, because you are not bound by treaties with regard to this. And I think the experience of the Mekong states will sort of tell us a little bit about how Beijing plans to work on this. I agree, that's a huge challenge. And again, the challenge is, how does Indian policy respond to that? Because as a lower riparian state, it becomes very, very difficult to do too much. You can, use international law and standards as much as you can. But the fact that China dominates sort of water flows upstream, it becomes really, really difficult for any of these states to do too much. And you will have to end up binding yourself in some treaties, or at least, I mean, the only other option that I can think of is that you need to sort of push conflict or push tensions in other domains to negotiate something here, because there's very little incentive unless Beijing really wants to negotiate. If Beijing wants to maintain hostility, it can continue to maintain hostility, but it has very little incentive to negotiate this away. And the only incentive can be that, the impact of this on the broader relationship. And unless that is brought out, there's very little that I can see that Beijing wants to do. But so far, mechanism has worked, apart from that brief interruption, which I think sent a very negative signal to New Delhi. And I think it's important for Beijing to reconsider this, because it doesn't want to, I mean, it's all fine and well to play these games, but at the end of the day, it's going to damage China's interests also. And one hopes that that is something that they will understand. But apart from infrastructure, there's also a lot of political stuff that's going on. And I mean, I remember us talking about control. Obviously, all of this is in the context of broader work in Tibet, and the Sichuan Tibet railway line that we spoke about is one part of linking Tibet to the rest of the mainland much more, because it was also something that came up in the Tibet Work Conference that took place last year, And I remember Xi Jinping essentially talking about how he outlined a sort of a plan, right, which was a hardline approach, which was a continuation of the hardline approach that began after the 2008 protests. And he outlined sort of a mix of tools, right? There was persuasion, development, connectivity, indoctrination, and also coercion. And in each sort of different aspect, he outlined what he wants to do. So, the persuasion aspect was that, look, we're going to create more opportunities for Tibetans to go and work in the mainland, and this connectivity will help. We want certain provinces specifically to lead on this, and Sichuan is one of them. He spoke about how, you know, he wants to forge the consciousness of the Chinese nation as a single community. And that was a sort of critical thing with regard to long-term stability in Tibet, which sort of, he said, links to long-term stability in broader China. So he talked about that sort of an effort, and part of that effort is obviously undermining the forces with regard to the Dalai Lama and maintaining control over succession. A key aspect of that is the sinicization of religion, which is again a continuation of existing policy. One of the examples that I recall is that from 2011 onwards, we've seen party cadres being stationed in monasteries around Tibet. And that the objective of that is to, of course, make sure that religion is sinicized and it does not challenge the legitimacy of party rule. He talked about education and reforming education, and I think the quote that he said there was, we want to plant the seeds of loving China in the depths of the hearts of every youth. Again, that is something that recently the chairman of the Tibet region, Chitaha, has repeated, and he talks about how we need to make sure that we promote the formulation of Chinese language education in Tibet. And he talks about how education reform needs to require us building Potongha proficiency test stations, and that's again something where you undermine Tibetan autonomy, and all of that functions under the idea of forging this community, the sense of a national community in Tibet, so that people in Tibet feel much more akin to China as a nation, as opposed to having this sense of an independent identity. And there's a whole bunch of activities that are planned. One more thing that I remember he had spoken about, Xi Jinping had spoken about in his speech at the Tibet World Conference, was that he wanted to focus on archaeology and look at ancient artifacts to try and build, a sense of community and to create that. And that I think is really, really critical, because you're digging into history to create a past. And when you create that past, it'll have a lot of implications, at least in my view, on the dispute in Arunachal Pradesh, because that will really, really change how public perception operates, how legal warfare will operate, because you're going to create selective narratives and you're going to push that. And I think we can take lessons from what happened with the South China Sea and understand that this is going to happen with regard to Arunachal Pradesh in the future. And I think it's important that India sort of also invests in these sort of narrative building tools which are going to be useful. We need to focus on history, we need to focus on archaeology and invest in those sorts of areas, because at the end of the day, you're going to see much more lawfare from Beijing, apart from actually changes on the ground like you've spoken about. And I think that's really, really important that we try to do this. Again, the last challenge that I remember, the last thing that he spoke about was about, trying to somewhat replicate what's happened in Xinjiang, right? He spoke about how you want to create development, so functioning markets, electricity, water, heat, and those sorts of things. But he also spoke about, making sure that Tibet is an impregnable fortress. And that sort of takes me back to the securitized and grid policing system in Xinjiang, and how we might see much more of that in Tibet going forward, along with all these long-term plans for education linkages, creating opportunities for mainland-based companies to go there, and for Tibetan labor to go to the mainland and work there. So it's going to be really, really tricky times ahead.
No, I agree. I agree with you, Manoj. And in the long term, I am sure at least as you said, regarding fortress thing, it's going to be difficult in the long term. Also, in the short term, some of the measures. So yesterday, I think you shared with me an article from South China Morning Post where it was saying that 15 new regulations are being implemented in Tibet Autonomous Region. Today I was going through these regulations. Some of the regulations have been in place since 1962 or 1959 when the Dalai Lama fled Tibet. But re-emphasizing those regulations, making a propaganda out of it, implies in the short term at least that securitization is going happening in a greater detail, looking at ccp's centenary, which is happening in next 2-3 months. So it implies that they know that much more securitization is happening, because to avoid any unnecessary incident happening in Tibet or Xinjiang. So that could be one of the important reasons that this is happening, in at least in the short term, I think.
Yeah, no, they wouldn't want that party that they want to have to get disrupted. All right. So what we'll try and do is, folks, we'll try and link all the pieces that we've spoken about in the show notes, so you can go through this. Again, as you understand, it's really challenging to get data on what's really happening on the ground in Tibet. But at least from what we can glean from Chinese language sources, official government statements, and media reportage that comes out, is that there are significant changes that are taking place. A lot of this is a long-term process to consolidate Beijing's control over Tibet. It already has a tremendous amount of control, but it's also in anticipation with regard to the anxiety related to the succession of the Dalai Lama. And that's something that I think we need to keep watching from an Indian point of view, because that whenever that happens, it's going to be a period of turbulence from Beijing's point of view. And it's trying to make sure that it's in control ahead of that time. And I think that's something that we need to keep an eye on. But along with that, from a long-term point of view, from an Indian security interest point of view, the infrastructure connectivity, the border village development, along with the overall process of sinicization of Tibet and securitization of Tibet, are all going to impinge on our security. And I think we need to think of how India sort of, if not counters, but at least tries to make sure that you mitigate the challenges that are going to arise from these. And I think this is sort of, the podcast is sort of, our aim has been to try and talk about these issues. But yeah, if you have ideas and thoughts of what India should and can be doing, please do write to us and share them with us. Thank you so much, Suyash.
Thank you. Thanks, Manoj.
The Takshashila Institution is an independent, non-partisan think tank and a school of public policy. We have education programs lasting 1 semester and 1 year that are tailored specifically for people like you. They are all online and you can take them from anywhere. Admissions are now open for our 12-week graduate certificate program in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, technology policy, and health and life sciences. Visit takshashila.org.in/courses to find out more. If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week, Siet Tires and thewholetruthfoods.com. So this week on Advertising is Dead, Varun was joined by Mansi Zaveri. She shares her experience of running a community for parents of young kids and teenagers and of hosting a podcast along the same lines. Gauri Devidayal was joined by Divya Thani on This Round is on Me. Divya works as a global editorial director with Condé Nast Traveler. They discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly of a travel writer's job. On Candid Kanan, Sid is in conversation with Adarsh Gaurav, who recently scored a BAFTA nomination for his role in the Netflix adaptation of The White Tiger. They talk about his role in the show, life pre- and post-stardom, and so much more. On Agla Station Adulthood, Ritash and Aishi talk about the precious time and opportunities lost to the lockdown and share their post-COVID wish list. When it comes to cricket this season, we have you covered. In English, we have Edges and Sledges, which do their show live on YouTube. They look for announcements over there. And for our Hindi listeners, we have Khel Niti, hosted by Rajiv Mishra and ex-Indian cricketer Sabah Kareem. This show is live streamed on YouTube every day at 9:15. Definitely do check these out and hope to see you again next week.
Whether you're an established sports person or a budding one, or simply a sports enthusiast, join us, Tanvi and Shlok.
We are two passionate pro badminton players talking policy, mindset, and everything sport.
So tune in to the Millennial Athlete every Monday.
Only on the IVM Podcast Network.
Trust us, it's gonna be lit.